He gave her bread with hands too callous to ask for anything back. She offered nothing in return, just silence and a child who wouldn't stop shaking. By the time he learned her name, she already owned more than he'd ever dreamed. The boy collapsed before the woman did. One moment he was upright, tiny fists clenched and jaw stiff with something like pride. The next, he crumpled in the dirt like a sack of wheat dropped from too high, the last of his strength gone before he hit the ground. The woman caught herself against the rail post, knees buckling but not breaking, her breath a dry rasp as she stared down at the child. She didn't scream, didn't cry out. Just sank to her knees beside him, her bonnet falling sideways as she pressed a hand to his chest. He was breathing, barely, but he was breathing. That was when Thomas saw them. He'd been crossing the ridge above the cattle yard, leading a mule with nothing but old tools and half a biscuit in his coat pocket. It was chance, or whatever folks called the thing that made a man glance down at the exact moment something important was about to die. He dropped the reins without thinking and ran. He reached them quick, boots skidding in the dust. "Ma'am," he said, not sure what else there was to say, only that she looked worse than the boy did. Her lips were cracked open like dry earth, her fingers swollen and red, her eyes glassy and unblinking. She didn't answer. She didn't even seem to hear. The boy lay limp beside her, face streaked with old dirt and fresher tears. Thomas pulled off his canteen and pressed it into her hands. She didn't move. So he knelt, unscrewed the lid himself, and tipped the water to the child's lips first. The boy stirred faintly, then coughed, a ragged, too small sound that made Thomas's chest tighten. The woman finally blinked. "I ain't robbing you," Thomas said gently, eyes locked on hers. "Just trying to help." She nodded once, a broken sort of nod, like she'd heard those words before and believed them less each time. But she didn't stop him when he shifted the boy into his arms. "My camp's not far," Thomas said. "There's a bit of food, shelter." Still she said nothing, but she stood, that was enough. He walked the boy the whole way, the small body alarmingly light in his arms, head resting against his shoulder. The woman followed, silent, her skirts torn and boots barely holding together. She never asked his name, never offered hers. Thomas didn't push. Back at camp, he laid the boy on a blanket near the fire, fed the woman from what little he had, half the biscuit, some boiled beans and the last of the jerky. She took it without comment, feeding the child first. Then she ate in stiff, mechanical bites like someone remembering how. When she was done, she sat back against a log and stared at the flames like they were a puzzle she couldn't quite work out. Thomas watched her in the firelight. She was maybe 30, maybe younger, hard to tell with the kind of exhaustion she wore. Her hair had been tied back once but had come loose in the wind, and the dirt on her cheek didn't hide the bruises already yellowing beneath. Her hands shook when they weren't holding something. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She looked at him like she'd forgotten how conversations worked. Then softly, "Clara." He nodded. "I'm Thomas, the boy." "Will," she said. "He's 6. Thomas glanced at the boy, Will, now asleep with one hand still curled around the empty biscuit wrapper. "He's tough." Clara's eyes flicked to her son. For the first time her expression cracked, not into a smile but something like sorrow. He had to be. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark a coyote called. Thomas stoked the embers with a stick, letting the silence stretch. "You got family nearby?" he asked, not unkindly. Clara didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was dry as the wind. "Not anymore." He didn't press. She looked like someone who'd already had too many questions asked of her, and none of them kindly. Instead, he leaned back on his hands and looked up at the stars. "You can stay the night," he said after a while. "Storm might roll in come morning." She didn't thank him, just nodded, wrapping her arms around her knees. It wasn't gratitude he needed, just to know she'd be warm. That night he gave up his blanket for Will and slept beside the mule, back pressed to the canvas tarp to block the wind. He didn't sleep much, not because he didn't trust them, because of how fast the boy had dropped, how brittle Clara looked even after eating, and the way her eyes never rested, always flicking toward the dark like she expected someone to step out of it. By dawn, Will was sitting up, cheeks fuller with color and curiosity. He stared at Thomas with big eyes, then whispered something into his mother's ear. Clara hushed him softly, smoothing his hair. When she looked at Thomas, her face was unreadable. "I can help fix your boots," Thomas offered, crouching beside the fire, "if you've got a few stitches left in that pack." Clara hesitated, then nodded. She opened a bundle wrapped in cloth, very little inside. Some thread, a scrap of paper, a dull needle, and a wooden button. Thomas set to work quietly, patching her boots with careful precision. Will scooted closer, watching intently. "You a cobbler?" he asked, voice still hoarse but steady. Thomas smiled faintly. "Nah, just had to learn after mine split halfway to Dagger Falls. Ain't fun riding with wet feet." Will giggled, just once, and it sounded like something blooming in the cold. Clara looked away fast. By afternoon, Thomas offered to ride into town for supplies. "You'll be all right a few hours?" he asked. "We've managed worse," Clara replied. He left them with his extra knife and a loaded rifle, just in case. The trail to town was long, but he made good time, bartered with a rancher he knew for dried apples, oats, bread, and a fresh jar of honey. On the way back, he wondered what her story was. What kind of storm had stripped her down to silence and worn-out boots? When he returned, Clara and Will were gone. The fire was out, the tarp was folded, but her bundle was still there. And in its place, beside the half-mended boots, sat something that didn't belong. A worn leather ledger with brass corners and an emblem Thomas didn't recognize. A rail stamp. He picked it up slowly, heart beginning to pound. Inside the cover, initials etched in ink. CMR the pages, names, numbers, freight logs, track purchases, ownership claims. Half the ledger marked to Clara May Redmond. He stared at it like it might vanish. Before he could decide whether to be angry, confused, or just stunned, the brush behind him shifted. He turned fast. "Didn't mean to scare you," Clara said softly, stepping into the clearing with Will's hand in hers. Thomas looked at her, really looked now. The posture, the calm, the way she stood like someone used to commanding space, not cowering in it. "I wanted to see if you'd come back," she said. "And if I hadn't?" Clara's expression didn't change. "Then you'd have proved me right about everyone." Will looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. Thomas didn't know what to say, didn't know what any of it meant, only that something had shifted again, like a board beneath his feet that wasn't nailed down. Clara picked up the ledger. "You deserve to know who helped you help us." And then from the trees behind her, voices. "Boots. Too many. And none of them friendly." The first voice wasn't close, but it carried, sharp, male, and coated with the casual cruelty of someone who liked to be overheard. The kind of voice that gave orders not because they needed giving, but because it felt good to be obeyed. Thomas stepped in front of Clara and Will without thinking, hand dropping toward the rifle leaning by the log. Clara's face didn't change, but her body shifted subtly, like she was taking measure of the trees, the distance, the time it might take to run. "How many?" Thomas asked low. Clara didn't look at him. 3, maybe 4, but if Pierce is with them, he counts for 2. "Pierce?" Clara's eyes flicked to his, and in them Thomas saw the same flint she'd hidden behind all that silence. "He worked for me, until he decided he could do better." Will clutched her hand tighter, and Clara's thumb stroked the back of his fingers without thought, like a reflex she'd done 1,000 times. The brush crackled again. Then a shape tall, broad, and too sure of himself stepped into the clearing, followed by 2 others. All wore long coats, dusty but clean. Their boots were polished, guns holstered easy but too visible to be coincidence. The lead man smiled when he saw Clara, not a kind smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Miss Redmond, fancy meeting you here." Thomas moved to stand straighter, but Clara didn't flinch. Pierce, she said evenly. Pierce tugged his gloves off slowly, like peeling away skin. We've been looking all over. Thought maybe you'd done something stupid like head west. But no, turns out you're just playing dead in the middle of nowhere. His eyes flicked to Thomas. This one of your new employees? No, Thomas said, stepping between them. Just someone who found a mother and her boy half dead in the dirt. Pierce's smile widened. That right. Clara reached into the bundle behind her and pulled free the ledger, holding it tight against her chest. You didn't come for me. You came for this. Pierce's face twitched, just a flicker, but it was enough. Now, Clara, he said, soft and syrupy, you know that ledger doesn't matter if you're dead. Thomas's rifle was up before the last word left the man's mouth. Try it, he said flatly. I dare you. The other two shifted, hands twitching near their belts, but Pierce just raised his hands, still smiling. Easy, cowboy, we ain't here for a fight. You came armed, you brought 2 men. I brought insurance. Clara stepped closer, her voice low but firm. I don't have the deed, Pierce. You know that, I never carried it. If you kill me, you kill your only claim to it. Pierce's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Clara didn't blink. Try me. The air held still for a long moment, like the entire world was waiting to exhale. Then Pierce laughed. Fine, we'll go, but we'll be back. Count on it, Thomas said. They left slow, dragging the moment out like wolves who'd sniffed a fence but weren't ready to test it. Thomas did lower the rifle until the sound of hooves was gone and the trees had settled. Clara didn't move. Will was still pressed against her leg, eyes wide but quiet. That ledger, Thomas said finally, his voice low. You want to tell me what's in it that's worth killing for? Clara stared into the woods a moment longer, then slowly sat down beside the fire, pulling Will into her lap. Her hands shook only slightly as she opened the book and flipped to the inside page. My husband, she said, voice flat, built track from here to Calhoun Ridge. Quietly, bought up land in names that didn't trace back to us. His plan was to sell it all when the route expanded west. Thomas sat opposite her, still gripping the rifle. And then he died, Clara said simply. And every man who ever smiled at me while shaking his hand showed up like vultures. She closed the ledger with a snap. That book is the only proof of what we own, of what will inherit if I live long enough to get to Carson's Bluff. That's where the deed is. Clara nodded. With a lawyer my husband trusted, the kind of man who doesn't scare easy, but he won't hand it over without seeing me, alive. Thomas let out a long breath, looking toward the trail where Pierce had disappeared. They'll be back, sooner than later. I know. You got a plan. Clara looked at him, really looked. I did. Thomas caught the past tense. He didn't press. That night they didn't sleep. They took turns watching the dark, trading the rifle between them. Will lay curled beneath a blanket, one hand on the ledger even in sleep. At dawn, Thomas loaded his mule with supplies and turned to Clara. You'll never make Carson's Bluff on foot with that kid, not without help. Clara didn't argue. They rode out just after sunrise, taking the back trails, skirting known roads and avoiding the wide-open crossings. Clara rode behind him, arms around Will, her body tense but steady. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was sharp and purposeful. Directions, warnings, names of places where friends might once have been. The second night they took shelter in an old storage shed behind a burned-out mining camp. The roof leaked, and the wind cut sharp through the cracks in the walls, but it was quiet. For a while. Then came the sound of hooves again, not close, but too many. Clara didn't flinch. Thomas did the math. They're tailing us. Clara nodded once. Friends of Pierce. She didn't answer, she didn't have to. He pulled the mule into the shadows and pressed his back against the wall of the shed, peering out between boards. 5 riders, slow, cautious. They didn't stop, they weren't ready to make a move yet, but they were watching, waiting. "We've got a day, maybe less," Thomas said. "We need to move at first light." "No," Clara said, "we go now." Thomas turned to her, eyebrows raised. "In the dark." "In the dark, they can't follow as easy." It was a risk, but so was staying. They left the shed with the moon at their backs, boots muffled in dead pine needles and frozen dirt. Will didn't complain, just held tight to Clara's shoulders as they moved. By morning, they were half a day's ride from the canyon pass. The road to Carson's Bluff forked there, one trail safe but slow, the other fast and steep and known for ambushes. Thomas looked at Clara, safe or fast? She didn't hesitate, fast. That trail broke mules and carts and knees, but it also cut their time by nearly a day. They moved hard, pushing the mule, skipping rest. And just as the sun reached its peak, a shot cracked through the trees. Thomas dove, pulling Clara and Will down with him as the bullet buried itself into the trunk inches from where her head had been. Another shot came, then another, wild, warning shots. They were being herded. "Up," Thomas hissed, "go left." They scrambled, taking the trail up the side ridge, veering away from the canyon's throat. The ground was loose, the slope steep. Will slipped, and Clara caught him by the arm, dragging him forward. Thomas turned, rifle ready, and caught a glimpse. One of Pierce's men, rifle up, grinning. Thomas fired once. The man dropped. Clara didn't look back. She kept climbing. By the time they reached the ridge, Thomas's lungs were burning. Blood trickled from a gash above his eye where a branch had caught him. They collapsed behind a fallen log, breath ragged. Clara looked at him, eyes fierce. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I did." "Why?" Thomas didn't have an answer. And then Will screamed. They turned fast. The boy was staring down the slope, pointing. A rider, alone, coat flapping, horse snorting and wild-eyed. Pierce. He rode like the mountain belonged to him. Thomas raised the rifle, but Clara grabbed his arm. "No, he'll shoot faster than you can aim." "Then what?" "I'll go." Thomas's heart stopped. "You what?" "I'll go down," she said. "He wants me, he doesn't want Will." "That's not a solution." "It's a delay. Sometimes that's all you need." Before he could stop her, she was up, walking down the ridge, ledger in hand, spine straight. Thomas stared after her, torn between running and trusting. And then Pierce dismounted. He met Clara halfway, smile too bright. They spoke. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he saw the moment Pierce struck her, and the moment Clara drove her knee into his gut and shoved him backward. Pierce fell. The ledger flew from her hand, landing near the ridge's edge. Thomas didn't think, he moved. Bullets flew. He didn't stop. He hit the ridge just as Clara did, grabbed the ledger, and pulled her back behind a tree. Pierce roared with rage below. Thomas shoved the book into Clara's arms, chest heaving. "You all right?" Clara's lip was split, her cheek blooming red, but she smiled, bloodied and proud. "I bought you 10 minutes, she said. And then from behind them, more hoofbeats. Coming fast. From the other side. The sound came not in a steady rhythm, but like a warning, hooves over rock, sudden, desperate, unfamiliar. Clara froze. Thomas threw himself over Will, pressing the boy into the dirt with one hand as the other leveled his rifle toward the ridge. His heart hadn't yet slowed from the sprint. He could feel it pounding in his throat, ears, the tips of his fingers. 1 second ago, it had just been Pierce. Now there were more. Clara crouched beside them, bruised and bloody but alert, the ledger tight in her grip. She didn't speak. Neither did Thomas. No one needed to say it. If they were flanked now, there'd be no clear path forward. Nowhere to run but down, straight into Pierce. And he'd be ready this time. The first rider came into view, then another. 2 silhouettes framed by the sharp line of the ridge. Thomas kept the rifle raised, one eye squinting down the sight. The horses stopped abruptly. The riders held still. Then the front one raised a hand. "Thomas Kane," the voice called. Clara looked at him sharply. Thomas blinked. "Who's asking?" he called back. The rider moved forward a step. "Name's Ezra Hart, Marshal out of Dust Rock. You're the one helped Widow Redmond, ain't you?" Clara stood slowly, her expression unreadable. "Ezra." The man tipped his hat. "Miss Redmond, damn glad to find you breathing." Clara's face shifted, disbelief, then anger, then something like hope trying to crawl up from where she'd buried it. "You're late," she said flatly. Ezra nodded once. "Always am, still got here, though." Thomas stood, lowering the rifle just slightly. "You're Law." "Marshal, yeah," Ezra said. "Weren't supposed to be. Retired 2 winters back. But your husband made me promise, Miss Redmond. If anything happened to him, I'd get you safe to Carson's Bluff." Thomas exhaled, just barely. "He sent for you." "He did, right before his last ride. Letter sat in the post at Crosswind too long, but I got it. Been riding since." Ezra dismounted, boots crunching on frostbitten dirt. He looked every bit of 60, but there was a steadiness to the way he moved. No limp, no hesitation, no twitch in the hand that rested near his belt. The second rider, a younger man, stayed back, eyes scanning the trail below. Clara crossed to Ezra, ledger still held like a weapon. "Pierce is down there." Ezra nodded. "I know, saw his dust. We cut cross-country to get above him." "How many's he got?" Thomas asked. "Too many, 7 maybe. And he's bribed half the local station deputies. Which means if you try riding into Carson's Bluff alone, he'll have men waiting." Thomas's jaw tensed. "So we're boxed in." "Not quite." Ezra glanced at the slope. "There's an old mine shaft east of here. My guess is Pierce don't know it's open again. Comes out a mile from the rail station." "Safe?" Clara asked. Ezra hesitated. "Safer than your current options." That was enough. They moved fast. Ezra's younger deputy, Cal, rode ahead to scout the mine entrance. Thomas helped Clara into the saddle while clinging to her back like a shadow. The mule followed behind, silent and stubborn as always. The trail east was narrow, choked with rock and thorn and bitter air. They didn't speak as they rode. There was no need. The danger had stopped being hypothetical. It rode just behind their heels now, breathing down their backs. The mine shaft looked like nothing, just a hollow between stones, half covered by brush. Cal had already cleared the entrance, his lantern glowing faintly in the dim. Ezra ducked inside, lit another, then waved them forward. "You sure this comes out?" Thomas asked. Ezra nodded. "Used to haul silver in wagons through here. Collapsed 10 years ago, but they cleared it last spring for salvage." Thomas looked at Clara, she looked at Will, he nodded. They entered. The shaft was low and damp. The air held that faint sting of iron and something older, like secrets rotted into the stone. The path twisted, sometimes narrow enough they had to pass single file, other times wide enough to walk beside one another. Ezra led, followed by Cal and the mule. Thomas stayed behind Clara and Will, his rifle always ready. They walked for what felt like an hour, the only sound the echo of boots and the faint clink of gear shifting with each step. Twice the lanterns flickered. Once, the ceiling dropped so low Thomas had to crouch with every step. But eventually the path curved again, upward, and the air grew clearer, fresher. Ezra stopped near a boarded half-door. "This is it. Comes out a ways behind the station barns. Quiet exit, no eyes." Clara stepped forward, her breath slow but steady. "Let's finish it." Ezra and Cal pried the boards loose. The exit yawned open, pale daylight spilling in. Clara shielded her eyes, and for a moment she didn't move, just stood there, blinking against the light like it might burn. Then she stepped out. The air was crisp, tinged with wood smoke and coal, the unmistakable scent of the rail line close by. Thomas followed, rifle low but ready. They moved quickly through back alleys and narrow lanes, Ezra leading them through paths clearly etched in memory. No one stopped them. No one even looked twice. The law office sat quiet on the east side of the square. Old brick, shuttered windows, and a name painted cleanly on the glass. W. Hollard-esque. Clara stepped up to the door and knocked once, then again. A moment passed. Then the door opened. The man behind it was small, neat, and balding. He blinked twice, then smiled. "Clara May Redmond," he said. "I wondered if I'd ever see you alive." Clara didn't smile back. "Do you have it?" Mr. Hollard nodded. "Of course, come in." The inside of the office smelled of paper, ink, and leather. Will's eyes went wide at the shelves of books, the heavy desk, the polished wood floors. Clara crossed straight to the desk, pulling the ledger from her bag and slapping it down. "I need to transfer this into official deed," she said, "and lock it under your name until I can reclaim it publicly." Mr. Hollard raised an eyebrow. "You're not staying." "I don't have the power to face Pierce in a courtroom right now," Clara said, eyes hard. "But I can make sure he doesn't get it either." The lawyer nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." As he worked, Thomas stood near the window, watching the street. Ezra stood beside him, hand hovering near his belt. "You trust this guy?" Thomas asked. Ezra nodded. "He's stubborn and expensive, the kind of expensive that doesn't flinch when bought men try to bargain." They didn't have 5 minutes. At 2 minutes in, hooves pounded into the street. "Pierce!" He didn't shout this time. He just dismounted, walked straight to the door, and slammed his fist against it. "Clara," he barked, "I know you're in there." Ezra didn't move. Neither did Thomas. Clara stepped forward, ledger still in hand, and opened the door herself. Pierce's face twisted the moment he saw her. "You think hiding behind paper men will stop me?" "You're too late," Clara said. "The deed's secured. The lawyer's on record. You try anything now, it's blood and prison." Pierce laughed. "What, you gonna run rail alone, with a child on your back?" "I don't have to," Clara said. "I just have to outlast you." Behind her, Thomas stepped into view. "So far," he said, voice steady, "she's doing just fine." Pierce's eyes narrowed. Ezra followed, flashing his badge. Cal stepped up next, hand resting on his revolver. Pierce hesitated. The street behind him was quiet, but Thomas could see it in the man's eyes. He was doing the math, realizing maybe for the first time he'd lost this round. "You can't protect her forever," he muttered. "No," Clara said, "but I can buy enough time for people to see what you really are." She closed the door on his face. The next hour passed in silence. The deed was finalized, the ledger locked in Mr. Hollard's vault. Clara signed her name clean and clear beside her husband's. When it was done, she sat on the bench outside the law office with Will asleep against her shoulder. Thomas stood beside her. "You did it," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer, not at first. Then softly, "No, we did." Ezra rode out just after sundown. So did Cal. They had other roads to guard, other pieces to hold down until Clara could rise in full and fight for what was hers. Thomas stayed. He didn't say he would. He just didn't leave. And Clara didn't ask him to. But the quiet didn't last long. Because a telegram came the next morning. Addressed to Thomas. No sender name. Just 3 words. "They found her." Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then folded it slowly. And walked back to Clara. She was brushing Will's hair, gentle and quiet. When she saw his face, she didn't ask. She just nodded. And said, "Then I'll ride with you." She didn't hesitate, not for a second. Thomas had expected questions, had braced for resistance, maybe even fear, but Clara didn't blink. She looked down at Will, smoothing his hair back, then quietly told him to go pack a bag with enough for a few days. The boy blinked sleepily, confused but compliant, and padded off toward the back room. Thomas stayed silent, the telegram still folded in his palm. "When did you last hear from them?" Clara asked as she began pulling her coat off the hook by the door. Thomas didn't answer at first, not because he didn't know, but because saying it aloud felt like holding a knife against his own throat. 3 months, he said finally. Last letter said she'd made it to Highwater Ridge, said she was staying with a woman named Ellison, widow, no kids, kept bees. And then nothing, Clara asked, already lacing up her boots. Nothing. Clara straightened, coat half on, and now someone else found her. Thomas opened the telegram and read it again. They found her, that was all it said. No name, no location, no signature, just a warning or a promise, he didn't know which yet. "I don't know what it means," he admitted. "Could be good, could be." He didn't finish. Clara didn't press. She just fastened the buttons of her coat and reached for her gloves. "Then let's go find out." They rode out within the hour, Will bundled into the saddle behind Clara, his arms wrapped around her waist. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't ask why the tension between his mother and the cowboy had changed overnight from smoldering to steel. He just held on. The trail out of Carson's Bluff cut east before it bent north, winding through fields still heavy with winter's weight. The snow had crusted to ice in places, and Thomas guided the mule carefully, watching every step. Clara followed in silence, her face pale against the cold. They didn't talk much, but the quiet wasn't empty, it was focused. Two people riding toward something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. By nightfall, they reached the base of Pike's Hill, and Thomas led them to a ranger's cabin hidden between the trees. It was locked, but he still had the old key. Inside, the firewood was dry and the roof hadn't caved yet, which counted as fortune these days. Clara set Will up on the cot in the corner, covering him with both blankets. "You ever think you'd go back?" she asked as she knelt beside the hearth, coaxing a flame from the dying embers. "To the ridge," Thomas shook his head. "No, never. Too many memories. Too many ghosts." Clara looked up at him then, her eyes catching the firelight. "Some ghosts don't want vengeance," she said softly. "Some just want company." Thomas didn't answer, because he didn't know which kind his past would be. They left early the next morning, riding until the trees thinned and the world opened into wide plateaus dusted with frost. The road to Highwater Ridge wasn't traveled much anymore, not since the new rail line bypassed it entirely. But Clara noticed things as they rode: burned brush, fresh tracks, hoofprints going in both directions. Someone else was out here, recently. As they came over the last rise, the town came into view, small, scattered, and slumped. Highwater Ridge had never been big, but it had once been proud. Now it looked like it had forgotten how to hold itself up. Shutters hung broken, paint peeled like scabs, and the chapel's steeple leaned at a tired angle. Still, smoke rose from 2 chimneys, and that was enough to make Thomas push forward. They rode straight down Main Street. No one stopped them. No one came out. "Where's Ellison's place?" Clara asked. "North End, edge of town," kept to herself. They found it easy enough. A small homestead tucked behind a low stone wall, the fence half-mended, the windows dark. Thomas dismounted first and stepped up to the porch, boots silent on warped wood. He knocked once. Nothing. He knocked again. Still nothing. He reached for the handle, and the door creaked open under his touch. Inside, the house was cold, clean, quiet. Clara followed, Will close behind. "Ellison," Thomas called. No answer. Clara moved to the hearth and touched the ashes. "Cold," she said. "Been at least a day." Thomas's eyes scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. No signs of struggle, no broken dishes, no overturned chairs. Just emptiness. Then Clara found it. Near the back wall beside the woodpile, a pair of boots, small, worn, laced with dried blood. Thomas dropped to his knees beside them. These were hers. "Your wife?" Clara asked. He nodded once. "The boy who used to write her letters every day, the one who promised her mountains and peace and wildflowers, was gone, but he still knew her boots." Clara didn't say anything. She just knelt beside him. Then Will whispered, "Mama, there's someone outside." Thomas stood in a second, rifle raised. Clara pulled Will behind her. The porch creaked. Then a voice, tired, cracked, female. "You got no business here." Thomas opened the door slowly. An old woman stood there, wrapped in a black shawl, a shotgun in her arms. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. "Mrs. Ellison?" he asked. She eyed him carefully. "Who's asking?" "Thomas Kane. You took in a woman months ago. Her name was June Kane." The woman's face twisted slightly, something between recognition and pain. "I remember her," she said quietly, "but she's not here." "Where is she?" Mrs. Ellison hesitated. Then she sighed, lowered the shotgun, and nodded for them to follow. They walked to the back of the house, past the woodpile, past a coop long since emptied of chickens, to a hill, small, freshly turned. Clara's hand found Thomas's without thinking. Mrs. Ellison knelt beside the grave. "She died 3 nights ago. Fever hit fast. I tried everything." Thomas dropped to his knees, numb. The grave was simple. No marker yet, just a cross of sticks. "She asked me to write you," Mrs. Ellison said softly, "but I didn't know where to send it." Thomas stared at the grave, his breath gone. "She said she forgave you," the old woman added. "Said to tell you she wasn't angry anymore." Clara knelt beside him, silent. Will stood behind them both, wide-eyed. And Thomas broke. Not loud, not wild, just the kind of break that starts deep and doesn't make a sound, the kind that swallows itself. Clara didn't speak, she just stayed with him. The sky darkened, the wind picked up. And somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. They buried her properly the next morning. Thomas carved a name into the cross, hands steady even as tears dried on his cheeks. Clara stood beside him, one hand on Will's shoulder. No prayers, no hymns, just silence. As they saddled up to leave, Mrs. Ellison pressed a folded piece of paper into Clara's hand. "She wrote this," she said. "Didn't want Thomas to see it unless he came." Clara nodded, tucking it away. They rode out without speaking. Not until they reached the ridge again, the same place they'd looked down 2 nights earlier. Thomas stopped. "I need to read it," he said. Clara handed him the letter. He opened it with careful fingers. Inside were just a few lines. "Tom, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope you made it here in time. I hope you didn't. Either way, I forgive you. I always did. Take care of yourself. And if you ever find peace, don't waste it. Love, June." He folded the paper slowly, then looked at Clara. "She forgave me. I heard. She was always better than me." Clara didn't argue. They rode on. But peace wasn't waiting. Because 3 miles out of Highwater Ridge, as the sun dipped low, Thomas spotted smoke on the horizon. Not cookfire smoke. Whiter, darker. "Carson's Bluff," he said. Clara's face turned pale. "No." Will whispered, "Mama." They kicked their horses faster. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the ridge. Below them, flames. The law office, the barns, the station. Burning. And in the street, silhouetted by fire, stood Pierce, holding the deed. Laughing. Clara didn't scream. She didn't flinch or sob or curse the sky, though Thomas would have forgiven her if she had. She just stared down at the burning wreckage of Carson's Bluff with a stillness so complete it felt wrong, like the wind had forgotten to move around her. Below, flames chewed through timber and cloth and memory. The rail station's roof had caved, coughing black smoke toward the stars. Hollard's office was a ruin of ash and glowing embers. Somewhere, a horse shrieked in pain before falling silent. But Pierce stood untouched. He held the deed high in one hand, waving it like a torch, the firelight making his face into something almost inhuman, twisted, gleaming, victorious. Men stood behind him, their outlines wreathed in smoke, rifles slung casual over their shoulders. Not an army, but enough. Clara's fingers clenched the reins so tight her knuckles went bone white. Will, pressed into her back, didn't make a sound. Thomas looked at her. He's baiting you. I know. You ride down there, it's what he wants. I know. Thomas looked back at the burning town. Then what do we do? Clara's voice was quiet, measured. We make him regret thinking fire would finish this. She turned her horse. Thomas followed. They didn't ride into town. They cut east, skirting the ridge in the dark until they reached the lower bend of the valley. The wind shifted, blowing the smoke away, and Thomas led them to an old livery barn a mile outside town, long abandoned, half collapsed. But it would do. They needed quiet, they needed cover, and they needed time. Inside, Clara dismounted, pulling Will down gently. He looked up at her, frightened but brave. Mama, is it gone? Clara knelt, cupping his face. Not all of it, not yet. Thomas took stock of the supplies. Not much, some oats, a half-empty water skin, the rifle and 6 rounds, his knife, Clara's pistol, and the old map Ezra had given them back in Dust Rock. He spread it on the floor. Clara came to stand beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. Thomas pointed. If he burned the deed, it's over. She shook her head. He didn't burn it. You saw him waving it. That's not for burning, that's for gloating, for proving. Thomas looked at her. So he still thinks it means something. It does, she said, but not what he thinks. Thomas waited. Clara knelt slowly, pulled off one boot and reached into the lining. From it, she drew a second piece of parchment, thinner, older. She unfolded it carefully and laid it beside the map. Thomas read it twice. It wasn't a deed. It was a contract. And at the bottom, beneath a sharp legal scrawl, were 2 signatures. George Redmond. W. Hollard. Thomas stared. What is this? Clara's voice was calm. The deed he stole proves ownership, but this proves fraud. Hollard made 2 copies, one for the vault, one for me. This shows transfer of shares to Redmond Rail, legally binding, and it names me sole heir. Thomas let out a slow breath, which means Pierce can't claim squat. Clara nodded. But the office is gone, Thomas said. The ledger, the record. Hollard sent duplicates, she said, to Carson's Bluff courthouse. 2 days before we arrived, I asked him to. I asked him to send them somewhere Pierce wouldn't look. Thomas blinked. You thought this might happen. I knew what kind of man Pierce was. You don't inherit that much greed without setting fire to something eventually. Thomas looked at her a long time, not with awe, something deeper, a kind of stunned respect. You've been 10 steps ahead this whole time. Clara looked away. Not always. He understood. She was thinking about her husband, about the night he died, about every step she hadn't seen coming. We still need proof, Thomas said. If the courthouse is next, we have to get there before he does. She nodded. It's 20 miles south, rough terrain. Thomas touched the map. There's a shortcut, River Pass. It's ugly, but it'll cut 10 miles. Then we leave now. He hesitated. What about Will? Clara looked over her shoulder. The boy had curled against a pile of old hay, fast asleep despite the smoke still hanging in the wind. She knelt beside him, brushed his hair back, kissed his forehead. Then she whispered, "Stay asleep a little longer." They rode out under a half moon, the trail rough and winding. their path barely visible between tangled trees and frost-slicked rock. They didn't speak much. Every sound in the woods felt louder than it was: the snap of branches, the scuff of hooves, the wind whispering half-heard warnings through the trees. By dawn, they reached the edge of the river pass and walked straight into hell. Smoke again, thicker this time, and gunfire. Ahead, the courthouse was under siege. 3 men crouched behind a wagon, rifles aimed at the doors. Another had already set the porch ablaze. People screamed inside, barricading windows and calling for help. Pierce's men. Clara didn't wait. She pulled the rifle from Thomas's back and fired once, clean through the man lighting the fire. He dropped, screaming, and chaos erupted. Thomas kicked his horse into motion, charging downhill with a yell. Clara followed, reloading mid-gallop. The element of surprise was their only chance, and it worked. The men scattered, caught between the fire and the fury. 2 tried to run. Thomas brought one down with a shot to the leg. The other vanished into the trees. By the time they reached the porch, the fire was smoldering, half doused by spilled lantern oil and panic. A deputy threw open the door, eyes wide. "Who the hell?" "Get the judge," Clara snapped. "Now." The man blinked, then ran. Inside, the courthouse was smoke-filled but intact. Papers littered the floor. One man bled near the wall, leg wrapped in torn linen. The judge arrived seconds later, robe askew, pistol in hand. Clara stepped forward, the parchment in one hand, the rifle in the other. "My name is Clara Redmond," she said, "and I have evidence of a fraudulent takeover attempt by Pierce Caldwell. He's stolen property that legally belongs to my family." The judge eyed the parchment, then Clara, then the gun. "You just shot a man on my porch." "I stopped a crime in progress." "You got proof?" She handed over the contract. "Compare the signature to the record you received from Carson's Bluff last week. You'll see the match." The judge called for the records. 10 minutes later, he looked up, jaw tight. "She's telling the truth." Thomas exhaled. But Clara didn't relax. "Pierce will keep coming," she said. "He won't stop, not until he's either dead or in chains." The judge looked at her, then at Thomas, then nodded. "I'll wire the federal office, get you a marshal with teeth." "No," Clara said, "there's no time." He raised an eyebrow. "You have a better idea." Clara stepped forward, eyes blazing. "I'm going to make Pierce expose himself." The plan wasn't complicated, just dangerous. Thomas didn't like it, but he didn't argue. Because when Clara Redmond made up her mind, mountains moved. They left the courthouse by back trail, circled around to the west slope above Carson's Bluff. The town was still smoking, but some buildings had survived. The saloon, the dry goods store, and the freight yard mostly intact. Pierce hadn't burned the rails, not yet, because he still wanted to own them, which gave them time. Clara stood at the edge of the slope, just out of sight, and raised the signal flare the judge had given her. A single shot of green light into the morning sky. Then she waited. And sure enough, Pierce came. He rode with 6 men, confident, armored in arrogance. He didn't expect to see Clara step into the middle of the street. Alone. He reined in hard, dust swirling. "Clara," he said, "you're a stubborn thorn." She didn't smile. "You burned my town. You tried to kill innocent people." "They weren't innocent. You stole my deed." "I took what was mine." Clara held up the contract, then explained this. Pierce squinted, then swore, then laughed. "You think paper stops me?" "No," Clara said, "but witnesses do." And then the courthouse bell rang. All around them, people stepped from the shadows. Judge, deputy, townsfolk, miners, railway men. All armed. All watching. Pierce looked around. And for the first time in days, he looked afraid. Then he did the one thing Clara hadn't expected. He grabbed Will. No one had seen the boy slip from the stable. But Pierce had. And now he held him tight, pistol to his head. "Drop it," he roared. Clara froze. Thomas stepped forward. Pierce pressed the barrel tighter. One more step and the boy dies. Clara's hands trembled. Thomas's knuckles turned white around the grip of his rifle. Then Will did something no one expected. He bit Pierce's arm. Hard. Pierce screamed. The gun slipped, and Clara shot him through the leg. Pierce went down screaming. Thomas caught Will, pulling him back. Men rushed forward, deputies, townsfolk. Pierce was disarmed and arrested. By nightfall, Carson's Bluff was quiet again. Smoke still hung in the air. But so did something else. A future. Clara sat on the porch of the rebuilt law office, Will asleep in her lap, Thomas beside her. "You think it's over?" she asked. Thomas looked at her. At the boy. At the town still glowing under firelit lamps. "No," he said, "but it's a damn good start." And for the first time in a long time, Clara Redmond smiled. It should have felt like victory. The fire was out. The courthouse was secure. Pierce Caldwell was locked in a cell reinforced with iron bars and guarded round the clock. His men, those who hadn't fled into the hills or been carried out on stretchers, were rounded up and disarmed. The judge had wired the state capitol. Officials were en route. And every man and woman who had once feared Pierce's name now saw him for what he was, a desperate bully who mistook fear for respect. But Clara couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bunk in the room above Hollard's old office, what was left of it anyway, and stared at the papers spread across her knees. The contract, the land records, the wire confirmations from the courthouse, all of it proving what she already knew: she owned half the Redmond rail. More once the audit was complete, but none of it changed what she felt. The railroad had been her father's dream. A dream carved from mountains, hammered into rails by calloused hands and sleepless nights. He hadn't wanted it for wealth. He wanted it for freedom, for connection. He believed towns were only as strong as the lines that linked them, that a railroad wasn't just steel, it was hope, threaded from one forgotten place to another. And she'd buried that dream beneath too many graves. Her husband, her child, the people who'd burned with Carson's Bluff. Even Pierce, for all his cruelty, had once been a child at her father's table, fed with the same kindness, told the same stories. That memory left a bitter taste in her mouth now. Below her, Thomas moved through the office, silent and methodical. He was sorting what was left, records that hadn't burned, supplies that hadn't spoiled, anything they could salvage before the officials arrived and tried to assist with their version of justice. She heard his boots pause at the stairs, then a knock. "You decent," he called. Clara folded the papers and tucked them under the cot. "Come in." Thomas stepped in with 2 cups in his hands, one of them chipped. "Coffee, more burnt than brewed, but it's warm." She accepted it with a quiet thank you. Their fingers brushed briefly. Thomas looked around the room. "You sleep at all?" Clara shook her head. "You?" He smirked, didn't know how anymore. They sat in silence a moment, steam curling up between them. Below, the wind shifted through the ruins of the town, brushing past blackened beams and half-collapsed porches. A few wagons clattered faintly in the distance, folks clearing debris, hauling what remained to the edge of town, rebuilding already, because there was nothing else to do. "Pierce is talking," Thomas said finally. "Says he's innocent." Clara laughed softly. "Of course he is." "Says he'll sue. Claims he's got backing from the Hastings Bank in Missouri." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Let him sue. I've got documents signed by the judge. The board knows I'm alive now. That's the only signature they need." Thomas studied her face. You really ready for all this? The lawyers, the hearings, the boardroom fights. She didn't answer right away, just looked down into her cup. I thought I wanted to fight him with fire, she said quietly. I thought I wanted to tear down everything he built, but now. She looked up. Now I think I want to rebuild what he broke. Thomas nodded slowly. Takes more strength. Takes more than I've got some days. Good thing you've got me then. It wasn't flirtation, it was fact. They sat there, drinking bitter coffee, the air between them softer than it had been in weeks. Then the sound came. Not loud, not fast, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats many. Clara stood, so did Thomas. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Dust clouds rose at the edge of the ridge. Riders. 6, no 8, no flags, no markings. Friends of Pierce, Thomas asked. Or replacements? He moved fast, grabbing his rifle from the desk. Clara headed downstairs, motioning for the deputy posted at the door to ready his sidearm. Outside, the town had noticed too. Men emerged from ruins with shovels and pistols. Women pulled children into cellars. Attention swept the main road like wind before a storm. The riders didn't slow. They came straight into town, boots kicking up dust, guns slung loose at their hips. The lead man wore a tan duster and a bowler hat, face half covered by a thick black beard. He pulled up outside the courthouse and dismounted with slow, deliberate steps. Clara stepped forward. That's far enough. The man didn't stop until he reached the foot of the steps. He tipped his hat. Ma'am, he said, name S. Alton Reeve. I'm here on behalf of Hastings Bank. Clara's blood went cold. Thomas appeared at her side, rifle at the ready. Bank doesn't send riders, Clara said flatly. It sends letters. Reeve smiled thinly. You don't answer letters. Because I've been a little busy with arson and attempted murder. He didn't blink. We heard, that's why we're here. You here to arrest me? She asked. He chuckled. Not at all, we're here to facilitate. Clara narrowed her eyes. Facilitate what? Transfer of ownership, reassessment of assets, ensuring the line's future profits are properly. Thomas stepped forward. You're here to take her shares. Reeve turned to him, eyes glinting. You the help. Thomas raised the rifle an inch. I'm the warning. Reeve didn't flinch. You pull that trigger, and the bank makes this town disappear. That rail line is the only thing keeping Carson's Bluff from turning ghost. Clara's jaw tightened. Funny, I thought the people did that. He looked at her for a long moment. We're not here for a fight, Mrs. Redmond, but we'll have one if you make it necessary. She met his stare. You'd lose. The air hung thick. Then Reeve gave a small nod. We'll be staying at the saloon, think things over. He turned, mounted, and rode off, his men trailing behind. Thomas watched until they disappeared. Clara exhaled slowly. It never ends. Thomas said nothing. He just placed a hand gently on her shoulder. That night they held a town meeting. Everyone came, what was left of them. Miners, widows, shopkeepers, stable hands, people with soot still on their faces and grief still in their eyes. Clara stood at the front of the chapel, the only building in town still whole. She held up the deed, the contract, the judge's endorsement. This is ours now, she said. The rail, the land, the future. Murmurs swept the room. But there's another fight coming. Men with suits and silver tongues who will try to say we don't deserve it, that we're not qualified, that we're too poor, too wounded, too backwater to matter. She paused, scanning the room. But they're wrong. This town matters, and we're not rebuilding it for them. A few claps, then more, then a roar of support that rattled the pews. Thomas stood quietly in the back, watching her. She looked different now, not softer but steadier, like fire that had learned to burn slow and strong, not wild and fast. Afterward, as people filtered out, he caught her arm gently. "You sure about this?" "No," she said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." They didn't sleep that night either. Not because of fear. Because of planning. By dawn they had maps, schedules, names of shareholders and sympathizers. Clara dictated 3 letters to allies in Dust Rock and 2 more in Elkhart. Thomas drafted a list of supplies. The town began forming committees, rebuild security communications. It was slow, but it was motion. It was hope. Until the fire came back. This time it wasn't arson. It was signal. A torch lit at the edge of the freight yard. Thomas saw it first. A single rider galloping toward the courthouse, shouting something too fast to understand. The man slid off his horse, face pale. "It's Will," he gasped. "They took Will." The world tilted. Clara ran. Thomas caught up to her at the edge of the yard, where a young woman pointed shakily toward the ridge trail. He was playing near the stable. One of Reeves' men said he had a message, took him, said it was from you. Clara went white. Thomas didn't wait. He mounted fast, rifle strapped across his back. Clara followed, her eyes flat with fury. They followed the trail into the hills, dust rising under pounding hooves. At the top they saw it. A single horse. A boy tied to the saddle. And a note pinned to his shirt. Thomas cut him loose fast. Will clung to Clara, sobbing. The note read, "Leave the rail, or next time he doesn't come back." Thomas burned it in his palm. Clara didn't say a word. She just looked back at the town. At the tracks. At the fire waiting to be lit again. And she whispered, "Then we burn them first." They came back down the ridge like thunder. Clara didn't let go of Will the entire ride, one arm tight around him, the other gripping the reins hard enough to tear skin. Her face was carved from something beyond fury. Not rage, not fear, something quieter, darker, resolve like steel cooling in a forge. Thomas rode beside her in silence, eyes scanning the tree lines, every shadow suddenly a threat. He hadn't said much since they'd found the boy, and he didn't need to. Some things didn't require words. Some lines, once crossed, left no path back. At the edge of town, people gathered without being asked. They knew something was wrong. They could see it in Clara's eyes and feel it in the wind, thick with smoke, silent as warning. Clara handed Will off to Mary Tucker, one of the few widows left from the Bluff fire, a woman with soft eyes and a spine like a railroad beam. "Keep him inside," Clara said. "Don't open that door for anyone but me or Thomas." Mary nodded once, and that was enough. Inside the chapel, Clara unrolled the map. Every remaining townsperson who could shoot or swing a hammer stood around it. The sun hadn't even reached its peak, but the room was already sweltering from body heat and adrenaline. "They've gone too far," Clara said simply. "This isn't about money anymore. It never was. This is about control and fear, and the lengths they'll go to keep both." Someone near the back, Baird, the old stable master, spoke up, voice cracked with nerves. "What are you proposing, Clara? We storm the saloon. They've got more guns than we do, more men." "No," Clara said. "We don't storm, we bleed them dry." She turned to Thomas, who stepped forward and laid down a thin strip of paper, train schematics, scrawled in careful pen. "They brought in extra riders last night," he said. "I counted at least 4 more than the day before, but they didn't bring them from the ridge. They came by rail." Clara nodded, "Which means they've got an engine stationed somewhere close enough to bring in more if they need, or flee." "And we know where," Thomas added, tapping a curve on the map. "Old Timber Mill Junction, 5 miles out. It's the only line that isn't scorched." Gasps rippled. "So we derail them?" someone asked. "No," Clara said, "we rob them." Heads turned. "We take their engine, their leverage, and we do it quiet." Thomas smiled grimly. They won't expect it. No one robs a bank's train in daylight. I need 5 volunteers, Clara said. Fast horses, cold hands. Every hand went up. She picked them carefully. Baird, Lee Gorse, who could shoot a pinecone off a moving fence post, 2 ranch hands, and Thomas. By the time the sun touched the tree line, they were gone. The junction sat quiet, nestled in a pine hollow, one long line of tracks stretching out like a vein into the wilderness. An engine idled under steam, its black belly churning low clouds into the air. 2 guards paced the boxcar near the front, their rifles loose, their faces lazy with heat. Thomas crouched in the brush, peering through a knot of thorns. They ain't expecting anything. They're too used to getting their way, Clara whispered. He glanced at her. You sure about this? No, she said, but I'd rather die on my feet than watch them take one more thing lying down. He gave a sharp nod, then signaled the others. The ambush was fast. Lee took the man on the left, one shot, neat and silent. Thomas dropped the second with a blow to the head. Clara climbed into the boxcar, pistol drawn. Inside, 2 crates sat chained to the wall, heavy, locked, marked with the Hastings seal. Clara pried one open. She stared. Then she smiled. The box was full of land deeds, dozens of them. Properties stretching from Dust Rock to Elkhart, names she recognized, names that had gone missing, people who'd sold under threat or worse. This was the paper trail. The theft recorded. She turned to Thomas. This is it. This is what we needed. But outside, gunfire cracked. Trouble, Lee shouted. Clara shoved the lid closed and vaulted from the car just as 3 more riders crested the ridge, reinforcements, likely on their way to Carson's Bluff. But they weren't expecting resistance. Thomas dropped one before they got within 50 yards. Lee clipped another's shoulder. The third turned tail and vanished. They didn't chase him. No time. Instead, they mounted the engine. Thomas climbed into the conductor's seat, scanning dials. She'll run, he said. Not fast, but she'll run. Clara jumped aboard last. Then they vanished down the line. A stolen train under stolen sky, smoke curling behind them like a fuse. Back in Carson's Bluff, the arrival of the engine was like thunder. People poured from half-built doorframes and buckling porches. Faces turned skyward, disbelief blooming into cheers as the engine came to a stop outside the ruined freight yard. And then Clara stepped off, box in hand. They opened it in the middle of the chapel. Deeds, names, proof. Judge Harmon stood in silence as Clara laid them out. This is every property Hastings tried to steal, she said. Every family they tried to erase. It's all here. The judge looked stunned. Where'd you get these? She met his eyes. Their train at their junction. He let out a slow whistle. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Maybe both, Clara said, but I know one thing, they're going to retaliate. Then we'd better be ready. The siege began at dawn. A whistle cut through the valley, long and low. Reeve returned, not with 8 riders but 20, all in Hastings colors, all armed. Clara stood at the center of the street, Thomas on one side, Judge Harmon on the other. The townsfolk lined porches, rifles at their backs. Reeve dismounted slowly. You really are a problem. You think I'm scared of bankers with guns, Clara said. No, but you should be scared of what comes next. He gestured behind him. And from the tree line came a carriage. Black gilded, and inside a woman stepped down. Gray dress, wide-brimmed hat, gloves like silk over steel. Mrs. Redmond, she said smoothly. I'm Evelyn Marks, Vice President of Hastings Rail Holdings. Clara's mouth went dry. You've made quite a mess, Evelyn continued, walking forward. Stolen trains, assaulted agents, interfered with operations. I preserved ownership of my family's company. You endangered federal contracts. You kidnapped a child. Evelyn didn't blink, allegedly. Thomas stepped forward. We've got the proof. You going to deny the train? Evelyn's smile thinned. I'm going to offer you a deal. Clara laughed bitterly. There it is. Sign over your shares. Publicly, we erase the charges. We rebuild the town. Your people get jobs, protection. You and your son get safe passage to wherever you want. And if I do? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Then we take the town the old way. Clara looked around. At her people. At Thomas. At the sky turning orange behind Evelyn's shoulder. Then she smiled. You should have come sooner, Clara said, because now it's our town. And from behind the chapel, from the edges of the hills, from every tree and rooftop, came the people Hastings had stolen from. Families Clara had found, miners, ranchers, widow mothers, armed, ready. Dozens. Maybe more. Evelyn's mouth tightened. Clara stepped forward. You thought I was alone. And she raised the deed. This town belongs to Redmond Rail, and Redmond Rail belongs to its people. Reeve reached for his pistol. But Thomas was faster. A shot rang out. Reeve's weapon spun from his hand. Evelyn didn't move, but her eyes shifted. And for the first time, she looked uncertain. We've got enough evidence to bury Hastings, Judge Harmon said, stepping forward, and enough witnesses to make sure the state listens. Your only move now is retreat. Evelyn hesitated. Then slowly she turned. This isn't over. Clara nodded. It never is. But as Evelyn climbed back into her carriage, Clara saw something crack in her gaze, just a sliver. Enough. The Hastings men followed her out. No shots fired. No one dead. Not today. That night the town gathered around the chapel. No speeches. No noise. Just warmth. And peace. Will curled beside Clara on the steps, head on her shoulder. Thomas stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the stars blink through smoke. She looked up at him. I didn't do it alone. He smiled faintly. No, but you led it. Are you staying? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, if you'll have me. She reached for his hand. Fingers laced. And for the first time in too many years, Clara Redmond allowed herself to believe in a future beyond fire, beyond loss. A future with rails leading somewhere worth going. The final letter called her to Elkhart, a last vote, one last fight for her father's railroad. Clara went, Thomas at her side while holding tight to her hand. In the boardroom, Evelyn Marks waited with lawyers and threats, but Clara had the deeds, the proof, the towns behind her. And when the votes were cast, Clara won by one. Back in Carson's Bluff, her train rolled in, not Hastings. Hers, a company reborn, a town no longer owned but owning something. And Clara, she wasn't just a widow anymore. She was the railroad.